Welcome back, pop culture nerds, to Digital Dissection. We have the privilege to speak to wonderful people across pop culture, and tonight's guest is no exception. He is writer and executive producer across Stargate SG-1, Atlantis, and Universe, and is the creator behind 2012's Dark Matter and Hulu's Utopia Falls. We welcome Joseph Mallozzi. How are we doing, Joseph?
I am doing great. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. It's good to see you. I know we talked about this before the show started, but do you want to duel against our Joe for supremacy of who gets to be called that name this evening?
You know what? I will defer to your Joe, and I will just go by Baron Destructo.
I accept your gracious terms, sir.
Excellent.
I mean, Baron,
unless you'd like to be Baron Destructo tonight, so it's completely.
I am not going to fight you for that. Like that is
all right. Okay,
that's a battle I'll lose happily.
Well, fantastic. Well, just to finish out introductions tonight, we are joined by our good friend Chris Schmidt, who actually joined us last year, if you guys remember, for some of our conversations around the 1986 Transformers movie. So, Chris, welcome back to the show. How are you doing this evening?
Doing all right. Excited to be here.
All right. Fantastic. Well, Baron Destructo, a.k.a. Joe, we do like to talk about the journeys of our guests that come onto the show with us. And obviously we know that your background is in writing, but we understand that your journey into writing may have been somewhat thwarted by your mom, right? Didn't she try to talk you out of becoming a writer at first?
In fact, she did. When I was young, and I used to write my short stories, and I think I wrote my first novel when I was in late elementary school. My mother was all for it, but then as you know, the reality set in that it looked like I actually wanted to pursue a career in writing. Then she, it was less appealing to her, and she pointed out that writing wasn't really a career. No one made a career out of writing. People were lawyers or journalists, and they wrote on the side, or maybe wrote a book on the side. And it took her a long time, frankly, to come on board or accept the fact that I could actually make a living as a writer. Although, I mean, to be honest with you, when I first started out, I didn't really know if I would be able to make a living as a writer. And I got to say, so far so good. I've been very lucky.
Yeah, I mean, it's great that you could turn what was a passion into a career. And Joe and I are still waiting on becoming male models, of course. We're not sure if that ship has sailed or not.
I think you're halfway there.
Well, yeah, thank you. Because we typically keep asking ourselves, why male models? But we've also been told that someone literally just talked about that for several minutes. But since you were looking at a career in writing from a very young age, has sci-fi kind of always been like your jam? Like, have you always had some favorite authors growing up, or anyone that's inspired you?
Yeah, absolutely. I was always a big fan of Harlan Ellison. I loved kind of the easily digestible short stories, like Ray Bradbury. I loved the twists, the turns, the shocking endings, like O. Henry, and that's something that whenever I wrote, I always sort of tried to I guess emulate the greats. So more than anything, in my series Dark Matter, if you've watched it, it's a lot of setups that don't pay off, but maybe episodes, sometimes seasons down the line, but everything makes sense. It's not like, let's say, a show that will essentially make it up as they go along, and it'll eventually, contradict what has come before. I like a very well planned out narrative that rewards viewers, and that's something that Ellison and Bradbury always did. They always rewarded readers with kind of that unexpected twist that kind of always pull the narrative rug out from underneath them. And that's what I, set out to do on Dark Matter. And that's the type of writing I love to write.
Oh, that stood out for sure. Sorry to interrupt. I mean, that was absolutely something I loved about Dark Matter.
I was going to say, you're not making it up either, because, I mean, literally the way that someone sleeps is a clue to something that happens later.
Right.
So I mean,
to be fair, the reason I was able to do that was because I sat on dark matter for, I think, at least 7 years. When I first came up with the concept, I was working on Atlantis, and every season we thought that would be it. We were done. We would go again, and then Universe, and then we went 2 seasons for Universe. So by the time Dark Matter got picked up, I had pretty much the 5-season game plan in my head. I knew all the character arcs, I knew all the backstories, and frankly, I knew all 13 episodes and pretty much every beat of that first season. So when we went in the room, usually it takes you about 3 months to break a season. We did it in about 2 weeks.
Wow.
This is a total newbie question to the field, but what does breaking a season mean in this case?
So breaking a season, once you get a green light, you assemble your writers and you get together in a writer's room and you essentially arc out the season. You know, what's going to happen over the course of the season? What are the character arcs? What are the stories you're going to tell? And then you go through each episode at a time and you break it down into, in the case of Stargate and Dark Matter, there were 5-act structures. So you put up your 5-act structure and you break it down into every scene of every act. And by every act, I mean the point at which you come back from commercial to the point at which you leave for commercial. So it's usually around 4 or 5 scenes, and it usually ends with that dun 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 moment that compels the viewer to stick around through the commercial break until the show comes back. And so that's what we would do. We would break a story into a tease, 5 acts, and then a writer would be assigned that story, and they would go off and they would flesh it out into an outline, and they would receive notes. And once they incorporate the notes into the outline, presumably they would get a green light to go to first draft, and they would write the script. And again, you would go through the notes process where you get notes. You would incorporate the notes into the script, and you would do a second draft, and then ultimately a polish. In Dark Matter, as showrunner, I didn't carry a room through production. A lot of shows do, but I didn't. I just became the de facto writer once the scripts were delivered. And so a lot of the time when you go into preparation for an episode, and all the department heads get together and you read the script, and the props department has any questions about props, they go off and start building the props, and the costume department goes off and builds the costumes. As the showrunner, sometimes I'll have curveballs thrown at me. For instance, a writer or an actor may not be available, or we may have to change the location, or the script is too long and not boarding, meaning I have, let's say, 7, maybe 8 days to shoot an episode. And given the number of scenes and the complexity of the script, we're not going to get it done in 7 or 8 days. So I have to find a way to make sure it gets done, or change the scene to accommodate an actor, or change the location. And essentially that's one of the many things a showrunner does once you roll into production.
It sounds incredible to do in 2 weeks, 65 acts worth of breaking.
Well, it is pretty crazy as well, given that, I look back on Stargate, and for a couple of seasons, we produced 40 episodes of television a year, which is crazy. You think about now that I think used to be 13, but now increasingly 10 is the norm for a season. Yeah.
Especially in streaming too. Like streaming seems to be like 10 is the number if you're going to be on any of the platforms. But I love that you've thrown out some of the influences that you had, because that's always where my headspace is. I like to figure out, what you kind of went through, and this is going to sound weird, but right away, when you mention Harlan Ellison, my mind went to, City on the Edge of Forever, from OG Star Trek.
Yeah.
And then my mind kind of rubber bands back to the fact that you worked on The Busy World of Richard Scarry, which also is a show book that interweaves multiple different characters and storylines. I got to ask you about it because I grew up on it. I mean,
that was my first sale. So essentially what I did, I knew I wanted to write. I thought about, I think my writing partner convinced me to look into screenwriting. And so I thought that's what I want to do. So I queried about 100 production companies to look to get my foot in the door, and I think 90 of them did not respond, and 9 of them did and said thanks but no thanks. But one of them, an animation studio, responded and said, hey, we're not looking for a script reader, but if you would like to freelance write for one of our shows, this is the way it works. We'll send you a series Bible, which essentially incorporates what the show is about, who the characters are, and you pitch us some ideas. And if we like one of your ideas, we'll buy it and we'll hire you to write an episode. And so I didn't really know anything about the busy world, which was scary, but they sent me the Bible, and I looked at the Bible and I read some of the stories, and I decided to pitch for a story called Patrick Pig Learns to Talk. And I ended up selling my first pitch. And, if you look at that episode, if you can track it down, it really has all the Mallozzi hallmarks in that. It's very character driven. There's a family at the center, which I think, as I often say, that's what all great sci-fi is about, whether it's, the Guardians of the Galaxy or the crew of the Enterprise or Team SG-1 or the crew of the Roslin Dark Matter. They're essentially a family. And so, and then there's this underlying sense of humor, and there's a twist at the end. So I'm not going to give it away. I don't want to spoil it for you. But if you track down that episode, it is really, distilled down into, I think it's a 7-minute format, a perfect model of the type of stuff I love to write.
Very nice.
Not only do we have it, it'll go out there.
Oh,
we'll post it. We'll share that story.
All right. Excellent.
Speaking of tracking things down, one of our fans actually tracked down a bit of your backstory and wanted to know more about it. They found out that you've mentioned that a book that you initially created that may have needed a little work, you adapted into a screenplay. And we wanted to know, what was the screenplay called, and was it really that bad?
I don't even remember. Just because I love to read. I've always read a lot across various genres, but I mean sci-fi in particular and genre in general. Mm-hmm. And I wrote a novel, and I gave it to my writing partner, Paul Molly, at the time, and he read it and he said, "This is terrible. This is absolutely awful." And I knew it. And he's like, "You know what?" He's like, "But even though this is terrible, I think this would make a great script." And so that's how I was introduced to the world of screenwriting. I picked up a book by Sid Field, who's kind of a master of the art of screenwriting. And I learned the format, which is fairly straightforward. And I ended up adapting my terrible novel into, as I like to say, an equally terrible script. But I ended up learning the format. And then Paul and I ended up co-writing a feature script that ended up getting us a lot of buzz, but sadly no sales. But it awakened my interest in the potential of screenwriting. So that was my story. It, started off as I had ambitions to be an author, and even today I realize it's just something that is not in me. I don't have the patience for it. I would never have the patience for it.
All right. Well, we were going to shift gears anyway, so this is a good moment to ask you kind of about something personal. Okay, we're not even going to get into sci-fi right now. We'll get there, but
it might be sci-fi related.
It could be. Could be. Mm-hmm. We did want to ask you about Suji because the adventures of your pug are fantastic. It gives me a smile every day. Got to ask you about Suji. How did the idea to dedicate, a YouTube, blog time, all these fun photos, where did that begin?
All my wife, to be honest with you. I mean, I've had pugs most of my life, and we ended up adopting Suji when she was 12, and she's going to be 18 in May, and she's like a cantankerous thing. It's great because she has more followers than I do actually on Instagram. She's almost like 40,000, and everybody thinks she's so cute and so sweet. And it's wild because sometimes we'll be walking down the street and someone will be like, "Oh my gosh, is that Suji?" And they'll want to take a picture with her, and she's like the typical celebrity that you think, "Oh my gosh, amazing," and she's kind of standoffish, doesn't really want to take the picture, but all the whole sort of Instagram, YouTube thing, that's all my wife. So I just borrow the photos that she posts and then post them on my timeline.
Fantastic.
Well, in any case, regarding Suji, the plan is she's going to turn 18. What I would love to do is have basically produce one more show, have it go 5 seasons, and then by that time, when she's like 23, then I'll just kind of monetize her Instagram account and just sort of, live off that.
You know what? I think in a world of at least like 4 or 5 Netflix documentary series about dogs, you have something there. This is a workable thing and easy to retire off of.
I was going to say, you've got to have folks in the industry, I mean, you got on Richard Scarry. I think Suji can get you a long ways too if you started asking for opportunities.
Yeah, I'd love to see her do like movie reviews or something. I don't know, something different.
Fantastic. Well, tell you what, we know we were going to talk about sci-fi tonight, and Chris, we'll hand the reins over to you because I know you've got a lot of things you've got questions about.
Well, he actually already answered some of it.
That's it. We're done.
Yeah.
All right,
everybody.
Great show, everyone.
Thank you,
for coming
Baron.
in.
It's been great. One of my first questions was just about when you went to Stargate, you were playing somebody else's sandbox. But I also know that you really did expand the mythology quite a bit. And I was wondering what some of that expansion was and what parts of it did you really enjoy expanding and how much freedom did you have to do it?
We had a lot of freedom. However, we always obviously worked within the parameters of the show's structures, of the show's tone. I mean, at the end of every season, the writers would get together and plot out the following season. And, it was kind of like the Wild West of ideas. Everyone would throw out their ideas and they would get expanded upon, and someone would take the idea and spin it. And come up with sort of an alternate version, and so that's how like these stories grew. So it's hard to say, pinpoint a specific contribution I made just because it was such a collaborative effort. I mean, I think back to like some ideas I had that Brad, for instance, ran with, like the idea kind of the gateway bridge between the Milky Way and Atlantis. I just thought, well, that would be kind of an interesting idea. And I don't know, it came up in conversation. He's like, actually, no, that is like a great idea. And then he ended up running with it, and we did the midway episode. And then we decided it was, a little too convenient, and we blew it up.
I was going to say, Baron Destructo, indeed.
Yeah. But I mean, there were always, I think, rather than sort of the mythological contributions, because I think we all had a hand in, there were certain, I guess, types of stories that the writers gravitated towards. And you could tell sort of what were the types of stories that we'd love to tell. So in the case of Brad Wright, he really loved those, sci-fi stories where the sci was very heavy. So I think back to the Stargate universe. There was that episode where I think they were stuck on a ship that was rotating, and Destiny had to kind of match the rotation. And that was like a pure Brad Wright story. Whereas Rob loved the ancient storyline in SG-1 and all those ancient stories, lines like threads. And frankly, I was actually quite, vocal about the fact that I hated the ancients. I just found it very boring, and I never wanted to write an ancient storyline. So I tended to co-write with Paul in the beginning, my former writing partner. And then as sort of things wore on, after like season 5, I would say, we actually started writing separately. So even though we shared story credit or writing credit on the episodes, because at that point I was writing more of the original stories that paid, whereas he tended to do more of the unpaid rewrites of other writers. And so just to be fair, we ended up sharing a lot of the credit. And I always tended to prefer those kind of episodes with like a dose, heavy dose of humor, or that would be kind of twists on kind of the sci-fi chestnut. So Ripple Effect was like one of my favorite episodes, in that you took the idea of the alternate universes and you just kind of stood it on its head and treated it another way. Dark matter. I mean, I kind of, in a funny way, say that I book in my career with time loop episodes. So Window of Opportunity was one of the first episodes we wrote, and it was, we leaned very much into the humor. And then for Dark Matter, I knew I wanted to do a time loop episode, and we couldn't get it to work in the room, and I ended up watching like two dozen episodes of various time loop themed episodes from like various shows. I watched about a dozen time loop movies, and I distilled the formula and kind of turned it on its head, and that's why we come up with the Dark Matter time loop episode called All the Time in the World. And again, you lean into the humor, and those are the type of episodes I personally tended to love to write. So it's one of the nice things about Stargate is we always got to essentially write and produce a mini movie every week. So each episode, because it was an episodic narrative for SG-1 and Atlantis in particular. It had a beginning, middle, and end, and we could do, pure sci-fi. We could delve into comedy. We could do horror, a bit of mystery. It was always fun.
Yeah.
So, do you hate the Ancients more or deep dish pizza more?
To be honest with you, I have to go with deep dish pizza. Okay. That is just, I just don't get it. The Ancients I get. I would prefer not to read or watch an episode. The deep dish pizza is outrageous.
Yep. And as card-carrying Wisconsinites who have driver's licenses in the state, we do like to make fun of our southern neighbors by calling that cheese casserole. And
it is a casserole.
I'm from Illinois.
Sorry,
we there.
Whoops.
Okay.
Yeah, y'all stepped in it there, didn't you?
I did.
Well, hey, you know what? You have to pay tolls on your roads, so you already have to own that one.
So do you. Down there, anyway. They're more for you than for us. Because I know which roads to go on that aren't tolls. So you kind of touched on this before when you talked about Dark Matter and how you mapped out the entire thing in your head ahead of time. But on these other shows where you weren't, in charge, did you typically do that for the things you created, the races or plot devices that you came up with, or were there more like the Furlings where it just kind of it got thrown in there? I don't know if it was you or somebody else, and then never really followed up on.
There was a fair amount of that. One story I'm fond of telling is that after season 4, Paul, my writing partner at the time, came into my office, just sat down, and he said, if this show gets picked up, we're in trouble because I'm out of ideas. Because if you look at the stories we wrote in season 4, they were all very standalone story that were not related to mythology. But one of the things we discovered as the show went on was that as we build that backstory mythology, there was the opportunity to go back and revisit those stories. So that gave us like story fodder and ideas for future episodes. So, as I said, at the end of every season, we would always get together and kind of map out what we had planned for the next season. So we had kind of a general sense of beginning, middle, and end. And, there were times when we would say, well, we want to sort of touch on the Jafar or what are the Jafar doing this season? Or, what are these characters doing this season? Or do we want to go back and revisit these characters? But certainly there were times where, like the Furlings who were mentioned, were never really explored. And I think really the problem with the Furlings was that I remember Rob Cooper coming into my office. One of the first things he requested of me in season 4 was he needed a name for a race, an alien race. And I was like, you can't come up with your own alien race name. And he's like, no, I came up with the Furlings, and Brad has never forgiven me. So, and I think that was one of the reasons, because we had created these creatures, the Furlings, and in my mind, they were like these, the Care Bears of outer space, these adorable furry creatures. And so when we did episode 200, we ended up showing the Furlings as these adorable little Ewok-like creatures,
Yeah. I was going to ask
and
you
destroying
about
their planet.
asking you about episode 200 was going to be top of my list here because so if you can tell, we're very sarcastic on this show. A lot of us just love comedy, and obviously comedy has to come with balance, right? And so when I look back at Stargate especially, there is this care of tonal balance, right? And it changes over the series, but then you get puppets in the 200.
That was, we went kind of all out with that episode. That one is certainly an outlier.
Yeah.
But I mean, like Wormhole Extreme, it kind of followed in that in Wormhole Extreme's footsteps.
Well, once again, these are the questions I'm asking on the side is about that balance. And I didn't know if you had, or you and the writers had any way of maybe tracking how you balanced either the comedic tone throughout an episode. You know, were there guardrails you kind of put in place for yourselves? How did you usually figure that out?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is instinctual. To be honest with you, when we first came on the show, we didn't find it particularly funny. But Richard Dean Anderson really made a concerted effort to push everyone in that direction.
Yeah.
You would watch the dailies sometimes, and you never knew what Rick was going to deliver when you wrote a script. Sometimes he would say your lines, sometimes he wouldn't, sometimes he would ad-lib, sometimes he would give it a spin. And over time, things kind of shifted in that direction, and we kind of embraced it. And I remember when we first pitched Window of Opportunity, it was very dark and very kind of a more serious episode. We envisioned, with this character who's trying to save his civilization by rebooting time. And Rob Cooper, co-exec producer, was like, no, how'd you make this change and make it like this and do this and do that? And then ultimately I said, well, we're just doing Groundhog Day. He's like, yeah, do that. And at the time I thought, well, this is a mistake. I mean, but in retrospect, that episode always tops fan fave lists. And I think, it also offers kind of a template of the type of story I love to do, but the type of story that resonates with sci-fi fans is there's that sense of humor. And as I often say, humor is such a great means that allows audiences to connect with characters. And it's, you look at the characters like Rodney McKay or on Dark Matter, the android, and they're the kind of the funnier characters that imbued with humor that the audiences for some reason connect with. And if you look at Window of Opportunities, there's that humor, and a lot of it is obviously character-driven humor, but there is on the flip side, kind of a very darker, kind of sadder element to that episode that a lot of people forget. And it's, this character Malachi who's trying to bring his wife back, and then ultimately at the end, after Jack's impassioned plea, decides to shut down the machine and accept fate. And there's that balance. And I always say having the humor there makes those darker elements in a way kind of all the more darker and stand out by contrast. Excuse me.
Yeah, I'm happy that you mentioned that because when I think about any property that I'm a really big fan of, usually there's a couple very specific gut punches, and I'm not afraid to cry. I think these guys know it, and I was not afraid to cry in that moment. But to your point about time travel and time loops and how they appear in media, I feel like you have to balance that with some level of like you mentioned, there's going to be some humor. There's going to be some darkness attached, but I think that the longer that characters have to progress with time loops, they do kind of go back and forth. You're going to be wacky 1 second thinking about like, I've lived this day 15 times. And then there's the realization of, oh, wow, I lived this day 15 times and now I'm depressed about it. Yeah. And so I really like seeing that balance because not every property that tries to tackle it does it that way. And as I mentioned, I did cry about this one. So I'm I'm fully admitting
Thank
that.
you.
But either way, one thing you've kind of talked about a couple times now, and we were interested in this as well as one of our fans. You've mentioned on your blog and in a couple other areas that you've had an open door policy throughout running Stargate operations over time. One of our fans is wondering, are there any stories from actors or your production team popping in that you haven't told stories about, or maybe a specific story about?
No. I mean, when I think back to Stargate, Jason Momoa came in and he was like, I want to go dark side. I want Ronan to go dark side. And so that's how the idea for, Broken Ties came up. And I have to say, probably Jason Momoa's greatest performance ever in that episode when he's coming down from the Wraith toxin. But I not really. I mean, he was the only one. I think Joe came in and he really more pitched Brad, Joe Flanagan, whereas Jason came in and pitched me, and we did that episode. But surprisingly, there weren't many times when actors actually came in and pitched story ideas. Sometimes they would come in and pitch ideas within the episodes. Sometimes, they had questions like on Dark Matter. It was interesting that it was like almost every cast member had a different approach to how they addressed script issues. So we would always have read-throughs because I wanted to make sure everybody read the script. And Roger Cross, great actor, always working. He played the character of Six on Dark Matter. He was always come in right after the read-through, and he would have suggestions or notes, and we would talk things through. Whereas someone like Zoe Palmer, who played the android, would always text me. I'd be home and I'd get a text, and she'd be like, "Just want to run this by you," or "Can I say this or can I do this?" Whereas someone like Anthony Lemke, who played 3, would surprise us on the day, and he'd be like, "Can I try it this way and can I do it that way?" And on the other hand, we had Jodelle Ferland, who played the character of 5, who never had a script note, never had questions, and would always deliver the lines exactly as I would envision them on the page every time. And she was amazing. She is amazing. And I always had her in mind for that character because the first time I worked with her was on Stargate. And she was 12 years old at the time. It was an episode called Harmony. And I mean, we were in the woods, and it was one of the few episodes where I was actually on set for the entire shoot. And she knew, at 12, she knew all her lines down pat. And if Joe or David would kind of flub or forget their lines, she would prompt them because she knew their lines as well. And she was amazing. That always, stuck with me. And I mean, she was a pro. She's been working, I think, in film and television since she was 5. I'm not surprised. She always has great instincts, and she should really work more. And when I get my next show, she definitely will be working more.
It reminds me of a young Hayden Panettiere, on Remember the Titans. I heard she was a very, very similar way of keeping everybody in check and almost like a quarterback for the production. She knows where everybody needs to be at the right time. So that's awesome. A really cool, really cool story.
Or maybe like one take Emma Watson on the set of Harry Potter, knowing all of her lines and everyone around hers. It's a very, very similar thing. But, hey, in a unprecedented move for our podcast, we actually have back-to-back fan questions here. Where one other fan would like to know that, would you support a unification of Stargate properties similar to how Ghostbusters brought generations together? And just kind of, what are your thoughts on the possibility of connecting everything together?
I love the idea. In fact, actually, that's one of the ideas that we kind of batted around for a potential movie, a Stargate Universe movie. The idea of coordination with Stargate Command that would see a team made up of members of the Atlantis Expedition and SG-1 make it to Destiny and help and essentially rescue the crew of the Destiny. So that was one idea that was kind of bandied about. The challenge would be obviously tonally, universe was fairly distinct, whereas SG-1 and Atlantis lead into the humor. But I mean, I think there would have been a way to go about it. So yes, I'm all for that.
Honestly, when I saw that question, my thought process went there too, because when you're talking about pretty much unlocking the secrets of the universe, like we're going before ancients here, and we're getting into literally the fabric of how things work. It makes a lot of sense to me, and not just because it'd be a fun cameo explosion and all that, but I mean but it makes sense to me. Like if you're going into that kind of space, no pun intended. That feels like the most possibilities you could create.
And not only a Stargate, a series like or an episode that would combine all three Stargates, but when Dark Matter was canceled, on the heels of the cancellation, actually MGM reached out, and we were in discussion about the possibility of finding a way to save Dark Matter that would have allowed us to do a Stargate crossover, which is something I pitched that I thought would have been fabulous, because we, tonally, I think Dark Matter is very similar to SG-1 and Atlantis. And we had a device called the Blink Drive that essentially allowed us at certain points to travel to alternate realities. And so I pitched out the idea and they liked it. Unfortunately, we just ran out of time and weren't able to save the show. So such is life.
I like the idea. I really do. And it's interesting too, because over the years you've talked about how, since we're not really quite sure, or I should say you are, because I'm not part of the production, but you weren't really sure at the end of some seasons, is this the last one or not? And it kind of it carried that way for a time until season 10, when they literally announced it at your rap party that we're done.
That was the season that I thought we were going back, by the way. I mean, every season from season 5 onwards, I always assumed we were done. And then, because that's what they told us, Brad said, welcome to season 4. We'll probably do a 5th season and then we'll be done. That's how, shows go 5 seasons. And then, hey, we got Sci-Fi picked us up. We're going to do a 6th season on Sci-Fi and that'll be it. And we'll be done. And then we're doing a 7th season, then doing an 8th season, then 9th season. And I remember when we were shooting season 10, I was down on set. I forget which episodes we were shooting. I think maybe, I don't recall. And, or The Quest maybe. And I saw Chris Judge and we were talking and Chris pitched me, this is why we have, they're going to pick us up for sure. And I thought, well, it makes sense because, we've got Atlantis, and Atlantis helps, SG-1 helps defray the cost of Atlantis. It makes sense to do 2 productions at the same time. And so I was convinced we were coming back for season 11, and then we were canceled. Although, one thing I feel the need to point out is that we almost had a season 11 because Apple reached out to us. And at the time, they were not into television, but they loved the idea of being able to save Stargate and essentially being home to an 11th season of SG-1. And so there were initial talks with them, and it was very exciting. And then SG-1, Sci-Fi at the time, contractually pointed out that we couldn't bring the show to another home if they did not allow it, and they did not allow it. So that was that.
Go ahead, Chris.
Sci-Fi's programming decisions in the early 2000s were the bane of any fan.
Yeah, between Fox and Sci-Fi, there's a lot of dreams that have dissipated, unfortunately, and we all have that hate list in our room somewhere. But I guess to the point of Stargate, being canceled at different times, though. There's something that Chris and I had talked about before our conversation, and Chris, I don't know if you want to expand on this or not about about the ancients and the grand plan here, and whether or not you want to go into that.
Are you asking me to expand on the question?
Yeah.
Well, I had a couple Ancients-related questions that I kind of backed off on after hearing the Baron hate become. I guess actually it was more about SGU, the one that's particularly of interest. The Ancients were presented at pre-Ascension anyway. They were explorers and they were reaching out, and that was the whole point of the Destiny, was to go out further and further and further. And there was a lot of room for growth there, as long as you didn't ascend anybody and make them all powerful. But I was wondering if there's anything you're willing to say about that grand plan for SGU that we didn't get to see on screen.
I get this question a lot.
I'm sure you do. I tried to find answers to it, but
And I have to say, there was a grand plan. Brad, had the grand plan, and he actually told me what the end goal was, and it was very cool. But because it was, one of the things after the cancellation, one of the things that he made me promise was to not reveal what that grand plan was, because he had hopes to finish telling the story. And I was, because I'm kind of all over the internet, and I've always been very accessible to fandom and always answered questions. So I kept my promise to Brad. So I always tell fans, if you want to know the ending, or if you have this question, I'm not the guy to ask. You have to ask Brad. And I know he's been doing stuff with the Companion, so maybe that would be like a great question to ask him one of these days, and corner him and find out what was the ultimate plan.
There's your future guest, Mark. Brad.
Yeah.
There you go.
There's got to be a long line of ushered people towards him right now, and we'll tag him on the post when we share the episode so that he knows.
Yeah, protecting an idea like that makes total sense. One of the things that, just to pontificate for a second, the streaming world has changed, is being able to revisit things, and we're seeing that with Star Trek right now, with Picard, and how they're doing exactly what Mark mentioned earlier, bringing these different properties together. And I can't help but wonder if the new overlords of MGM may opt to do that with Stargate.
Yeah, I think they're smart enough to know that they can't do a hard reboot.
Right.
So from what I heard, I think they've gone to the Expanse guys, and they're getting them to create a series that is set in the same world. So within the world, and I have no idea. I mean, I think The Expanse was a great show. Tonally, it was very different from Stargate, but I think, pardon me, I'm losing my voice. Mark Fergus, from what I heard, was a fan of Stargate Universe. So I think if any Stargate incarnation would kind of mesh with the tone of an Expanse, that would be it. So maybe he would do something along the lines of an SGU type of Stargate show. Although, in my mind, like they're doing with Star Trek, I don't see why we couldn't have multiple Stargates and tonally different Stargates. So, Mark and Hawk can do the SGU one, and I'd be happy to do the Atlantis or SG-1 type of Stargate series.
Yeah.
Or I'm sure I say I, but I'm sure Brad, Rob.
The creators might want to roll, you're saying?
Yeah.
That makes sense.
It makes you wonder, too, if you should even take it down the animation route like Star Trek did with Lower Decks. I do think there would be interest in such a thing, as you mentioned, Joseph, with some tonal differences that could what lead down a completely different creative path, for the teams. And
yeah, it's possible. I mean, I don't know. I mean, what I've seen of Lower Decks, it feels really more comedic. Like they really lean into the comedy. So I don't know. Obviously, that would be right for an SG-1 or Atlantis type series. It could be right for like another sort of an animated series. But I don't know. I mean, I'm a big fan of anime.
Yeah.
But you don't really find that type of serious animated storytelling in North America.
Yeah.
All that much.
Yeah.
You see some one-shots, like the Dead Space video game series did like a one-shot movie. Resident Evil takes a shot at that every now and again too, and those are good for like these standalone stories. I think if that was the whole series, though, it could collapse into that Castlevania Netflix feel where it's like, what, do I need to start buying eyeliner? It's dark all the time. Am I that emo? But I get what you're saying. There's a lot of obviously care that goes into the tonal balance, and you don't want it to get away from you. But we've talked about dark matter quite a few times. We knew we were going to do that, but it does lend into another question that Joe's going to take away for us here.
Yeah, so fans want to know, since Dark Matter is taken off Netflix in late 2022, is there a chance we'll move to a different platform again? And if so, would you be able to shop it to the last two, the proposed 2 seasons of the 5-season arc?
It is on. I think it's moved to CW Seed. I don't know how many people have seen
yeah,
it.
it's on
So,
there.
yeah. So I have spoken to Jay Firestone, who's the president of Prodigy Pictures, the production company that produced the show, and he's reached out about the possibility of doing more dark matter. I think at this point, unfortunately, I don't think the season 4 and 5 idea kind of makes sense because they would have happened on the heels of the alien invasion that ends season 3. I think what I would love to do is pitch a miniseries, like a 6-episode miniseries that picks things up maybe 7 years later. The classic getting the band back together. I could tell the alien storyline, and then if it performs well, complete the plan with a second miniseries that focuses on the android revolution.
Yeah, I was wondering that because when you and I first connected last year, I actually hadn't seen Dark Matter yet, and our mutual connection, Rosie, who's just a lovely lady, and I love getting to interact with her. Once she turned me on to that, I got sucked right in because of your writing style, of course, and how, like you've mentioned previously, you're always building towards something, and I feel like you're to sci-fi what like Mitchell Hurwitz was to comedy with like Arrested Development, because there's so much that kind of wove in, and you almost have to rewatch the show 3 or 4 times to pick up everything, right? And you're always going to find something new. So to that end, that's why I was really upset with Netflix when they did that, because I will habitually go back and rewatch series just to help pick up something new.
I appreciate that. I mean, and like I said, that's what I love. I love the setups and the payoffs, and some of those, some of them were very obvious. What we would set up and then what we would pay off, but some of them were very subtle. And I was just talking about that this morning. The fact that, for instance, in season 1, episode 7, the one with Wendy the robot, we have the Natalie Brown character die in the pod, and we have 5. But Jodelle kind of sadly looked down at her, and then I remember asking Jodelle, "Now cock your head like you have an idea." And so she did that. And, some of the fans thought it was kind of a weird response, and then no one thought anything of it. And then it's not until season 3, I think, I don't know which episode, one of the early episodes, where, Jodelle's character 5 is in a room, and she checks the computer, and it's like, process complete. And it's like, ding. And then you realize what she did was she uploaded this character's, essentially, her essence into the ship. So essentially, when she died, her neural template was stored in the pod that took this long to upload into the ship. So little things like that. I love the fact that fans can go back and say, "Oh, that's what that meant," or "That's what she meant," or Yeah. And it's frankly frustrating because there was so much more I wanted to pay off in season 4 and season 5 that I didn't get a chance to do that.
Well, we're pulling for you. I would love to see. I'd love to see a miniseries. I mean, honestly, anything that could help continue what we got, because I mean, sci-fi and like cliffhangers just go kind of hand in hand. Obviously, you've done that to perfection in quite a few areas, and I feel like that's kind of what the burden is of being a sci-fi fan, is that you're going to get to a point and you're not sure, what's going to happen.
To be honest with you, it really shouldn't be that way. One of the things I said in retrospect, I don't think in the future I would probably shy away from cliffhangers, But also, as a network, when you pick up a show, you're asking fans to invest their time, to invest emotionally in these characters and the storyline. And I think if the fans are basically trusting you and coming on board, you owe it to them to finish that storyline. So at the very least, they should have given us the opportunity to finish that storyline in the form of, like, let's say, a movie. And that's something that Jay, I said, the president of Prodigy Picture, requested. He sent an email after the cancellation. It's like, hey, can we at least, finish the story for the fans? And never received a response. Which is basically why, I say, I kind of lost it. Just the way things kind of happened on Dark Matter, I didn't think was very cool, shall we say.
The good news is we have an explicit rating on this show, so if there's any words that you want to choose, feel free.
Yeah, but he might have to work with these people in the future.
Yeah.
So,
That's true. That's very true.
Well, to be honest with you, unlikely, because, I really went off on social media after the... yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it disintegrated.
Yeah, they got torched. From what I heard, actually, they were not happy about it either.
Oh, man. Well, you know what? Either way, they know what they did, so don't feel bad.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But on the topic of fans, one of the things that we wanted to circle back to on that, because it's come up a couple of times here, how engaged you are with your fan communities. I mean, going back, and for one, the fact that you've been blogging for 15 years nonstop, and your Twitter is one of the most active ones that I follow. I mean, you are incredibly engaging with what you're doing, whether it's behind the scenes. We've obviously mentioned adorable pugs and all that, but how did this process begin for you from a social media strategy? Did you map out the process? I mean, you literally reward your fans.
No, I mean, it really comes down to the fact that I appreciate fandom as a genre fan. I growing up, I didn't have access to something like Twitter, and I wouldn't have been able to sort of interact with my favorite authors. And knowing that you can do it now is really what kind of spurs me. And I'm actually touched that I have as many followers as I do, and they continue to reach out, communicate, and I try to answer as much as possible and like as much as possible. Although for some reason, Twitter over the past couple of years, I would say, I'm not seeing all of my notifications, but I try to be as accessible as possible. And one of the things I always say is, fandom is a double-edged sword. They're very passionate, and they can get behind you, and things can turn very ugly as well. And I'm very mindful of that. And I was very mindful of that. That was a big wake up for me on Stargate.
That was a very careful balance that we were going to ask you about.
Yeah.
I mean, were there any moments in that teeter-totter where maybe we got a little too close to the sun? Any engagements have been like that?
Not really. I look back on Stargate, for instance, and when Daniel left, the Daniel Jackson character, his fans were very angry, and I did spar with them online. So I never shied away from the confrontation when I sort of felt that, for instance, that the show was being disrespected. But I always sort of kept sort of an open channel, although, to be honest with you, that has changed of late. I just reached the point where, just on Twitter, I've just gotten fed up. And I used to just ignore people, and then I just muted them. And now I block. And I'll be honest with you, my block list is getting close to 16,000.
Wow.
No joke. I won't put up with that anymore. And it's not really just rudeness related to Stargate, but I mean, just in general now, I'm a serial blocker now. I basically, if you say something that I think is really untoward or you know, you're doxing someone, you're harassing someone, you're you know, for various reasons, you're shilling or whatever, I will block.
It's a good move. Obviously, I don't have to deal with nearly the level of following you have, but even we have to deal with that too, with blocking accounts, and much easier. I think you're better for it.
Yeah. I guess. I mean, I could mute, but I mean, at the end of the day, I just, you know, at least with blocking, you're making a point, I guess.
There you go.
It's a much firmer stance to block than the mute.
Yeah. Well, tell you what, Joe, aka Baron Destructo, you have survived a digital dissection, and we really do appreciate you joining us. It's been
really
fantastic.
Appreciated you inviting me. It's great to get back into the podcast swing of things.
Yeah, and on that note, at the end of things here, we do like to offer the floor to our guests, and if you want to tell people about what you're focusing on now, how to find you, all that good stuff.
You know, I am focusing on development right now, and I'm juggling about 8 to 10 different projects in various arenas, various genres. And, you know, maybe one of them will go soon. Maybe one of them will go later. Maybe none of them will go. And I'll be free to do podcasts every week for the foreseeable future. But in the meantime, you can find me on my blog, josephmallozzi.com. I'm on the Stargate subreddits. Or you can come find me on Twitter under Baron Destructo.
Fantastic. Well, I will definitely be in the comments. I hope I'm not to the point where you feel the need to use the block button. And obviously, we look forward to staying in touch and supporting you in any way that we can.
Thank you, guys.
With that, we thank you for listening to Digital Dissection. As always, we appreciate all the Dissection crew does for us week after week.
Your support goes a long way, and if you happen upon this show by accident, why not drop us a review or comment on the show?
These guys also like hearing from you, so feel free to message them over at digitaldissectionpodcast@gmail.com. The dissectors welcome your ideas for future shows and, well, anything tastefully done.
I'm Joseph Mallozzi, and until next time, keep on dissecting.